The meeting to welcome Peter Taaffe, General Secretary of the Socialist Party.
Comrade Chair, comrades, I think we've had a tremendous outlining and analysis of the suffering of the Tamil-speaking people in Sri Lanka and the horrors which hundreds of thousands of people are suffering at the present time in Sri Lanka. And during the course of the contributions of Comrade Ramesh, of Comrade Paramay Eswaran, and of Senam, I actually thought back on the first time that I visited Sri Lanka, which was in May 1977, something like 32 years ago. And quite frankly, although Sri Lanka is supposed to be called serendipity, that's paradise, it wasn't a paradise at that stage. But compared to the horror today, it was a paradise in terms of the living standards of the working people, in terms of the collaboration between the different peoples in Sri Lanka. And the question that we have to ask here tonight is, why has Sri Lanka arrived at this point? And even more important, the question posed by the three previous speakers, which is the way forward for the Tamil-speaking people, for the Sinhala people, for the Muslim peoples of Sri Lanka, all of whom I have discussed with and collaborated with in the course of the last 30 years. Now, first of all, unfortunately, genocidal state terror is nothing new in the history of the world. But if there is a book which is going to gather together even the major incidents of inhuman actions taken by the state against minorities, one of the worst chapters will be written in relation to what happened in Sri Lanka in the course of the last 30 or so years. Because it's horror upon end, and it will not come to an end, by the way, if you look at the situation in Sri Lanka today, unless the force that's only capable of taking society forward, the organised working class in Sri Lanka and in India and internationally raises its voice. Ramesh said in one of his contributions, and it was repeated by Comrade Paramay Eswaran, where is the international community? Well, as far as I'm concerned, there's two international communities. There's the international community of the rich, the powerful, and the governments that represent them. And there's the international community of working people and the poor, who are the only ones in the long run who will come to the defence of the peoples of Sri Lanka at the present time. Now, we have to say that the Rajapaksa government has learned very well in the school of British imperialism. We are here in London, the centre of one of the greatest imperialist powers in the world, that built its democracy, let us remember, on the basis of the exploitation of 1/4 of humankind, who at one stage owned, as a matter of fact, Sri Lanka in the sense that it was a colony of British imperialism. They used the methods of divide and rule. The present horrors in Sri Lanka are not of just the period of independence. They were laid by British imperialism of the policies of divide and rule in maintaining the position that they had in that island. Also, the policies that they're pursuing today of internment, that Rajapaksa is pursuing today, and let us also say, is the biggest open prison in the world. There is no parallel to what is taking place at the present time in the north of Sri Lanka. Perhaps the only parallel is what British imperialism did in South Africa during the Boer War, when they resorted to internment, and that laid the basis of hatred, which led, by the way, to apartheid. That's the incredible, if you like, irony of the situation. What you do today, especially on discrimination against minorities of racism, as sure as night follows day, you will pay for that at some time in the future. And the role of British imperialism in the Boer War led, as we know, to generations of hatred, which led to the Boers eventually getting a majority and then imposing one of the most vicious, if you like, discriminatory regimes in the history of the world itself. We also have the example of Malaysia. And by the way, the Rajapaksa government is probably considering Malaysia as some kind of model for Sri Lanka in the next period. Very difficult, as I will explain in a moment, to actually carry that through. But in Malaysia, in the defeat of the Malayan Communist Party, unfortunately based on a minority of the Chinese, and therefore they could not win, in that particular battle, they managed to maintain the position by relocating the populations, the Chinese population, into controlled villages, and in that way isolating the guerrillas in Malaysia at that particular moment in time. They did the same in Kenya, let us remember, when they hung 1,000 members of the Kikuyu. This is what British imperialism, this democratic regime that is based here in London, and therefore to expect them to come to the assistance of the Tamil-speaking people, a blood-spattered regime with a history like this, I think is utopian unless you exert pressure from the organised working class and the labour movement internationally. And last but not least, just over the water in Northern Ireland, the internment without trial in 1971, and I was in Ireland, by the way, 1 week before this particular development, together with Bloody Sunday. I was also there 1 week before Bloody Sunday as well, with the massacre by British soldiers of innocent civilians in Derry. That resulted in mobilising previously inactive, non-political youth who were looking towards socialism, by the way, who came along to meetings of Catholics and Protestants, of something like 150 in Derry at that particular stage, and were supporting the idea of class unity. That was the best recruiting sergeant for the IRA, which launched this campaign of the last 30 years, which has resulted in what? A guerrilla campaign that's ended up with, in effect, the IRA actually abandoning their particular guerrilla campaign in the process. Now, as sure as night follows day, leave everything else aside, the methods used by the Rajapaksa government today in the internment camps of the north of Sri Lanka are creating the fighters of tomorrow against their regime. It's not an accident that in the prisons of Tsarist Russia, we had developing a generation who in turn went on to overthrow Tsarism. The prisons were the universities of the revolution. I'm not saying that's necessarily taking place in the camps, but if you want terrorism to scar Sri Lanka for time immemorial, do what you're doing. The Rajapaksa government is doing now in the north of Sri Lanka. Imagine the situation. 300,000 people virtually living in the open. At the time of the monsoon, 11,000 are supposed to be rehabilitated by the government. What does that mean? Indoctrinated, tortured, forced to give up their nationality and their beliefs. That's in effect what is happening in the north of Sri Lanka at the present time. We say that they should be allowed to leave immediately. Not just the 300,000, but the 11,000 should be allowed to leave immediately. This is supposed to be a democracy. It's unbelievable when you think about it. Sri Lanka is still in its constitution the Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka, on the basis of methods more connected with dictatorship, and it is a dictatorship. Even The Economist said this is an elected dictatorship. There's elections, formally speaking, but what kind of elections can you have at the point of a bayonet, and moreover based upon one section of the population itself?